Great. Thanks so much, Anna. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar addressing survivors' economic and consumer barriers to housing. My name is Yvette Butler, and I'm the Director of Capacity Building and Systems Change with the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice. I'm joined by Sarah Wee, our Director of Programs, who will introduce herself in a moment. We're also joined by Claire Johnson-Raba, Clinical Teaching Fellow in the Consumer Law Clinic at the University of California, Irvine School of Law, and students Ronan, Kevin, and Sai from the Consumer Law Clinic and Domestic Violence Clinic. They'll also introduce themselves more fully in a few minutes as well. As we're getting started, please feel free to start introducing yourselves in the chat, your name, where you're from, and what you do. Also, please share the economic or consumer barriers to accessing or maintaining housing that you currently see survivors facing. We would love to start getting your perspectives. In today's call, Claire and her students will identify credit and other economic issues survivors face when seeking housing, discuss advocacy strategies and legal remedies available to address those barriers. We also hope you'll leave here with tools and resources to address those barriers in your own work. I'll start by giving a brief overview of CSAJ's mission and vision, then turn it over to Sarah to give an overview of the housing landscape. Finally, Claire and her students will discuss the legal remedies and strategies to address credit and economic-related barriers to accessing and maintaining housing. CSAJ envisions a world where all people have equal access to physical safety, economic security, and human dignity. Towards that end, we promote advocacy approaches that improve professional practices, such as this webinar, enhance organizational responses, and advocate for approaches that remove systemic barriers, all to meet the self-defined needs of domestic and sexual violence survivors. This slide shows 3 of our key projects. Of note, this webinar is part of our Consumer Rights for Domestic and Sexual Violence Survivors initiative, which is designed to enhance civil legal advocacy of domestic and sexual violence attorneys and advocates, and to build partnerships between those attorneys and advocates and consumer lawyers. I'll now turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Yvette, and hi, everyone. This is Sarah Wee. As Yvette mentioned, I am CSAJ's Director of Research and Programs. I'm just going to provide a little bit of landscaping in a couple of ways before handing it off to Claire and others from UC to dive in today. So first I'm going to talk about the guidebook and just some key features and values that really guide this webinar and we hope help make that resource accessible to you, and then provide an overview of the housing landscape so that we're all on the same page. And I'd love to hear from folks as you're joining. I see folks from Indiana, North Carolina, Missouri, all across the country. It'd be great to hear if you are a housing advocate or in a housing-specific program, if you're from a community-based organization, if you're from some other context, just so that we can really soak up and use your expertise in the room today. And I know we'll have other questions and kind of unpack that later. So kind of let us know where you're coming from. So as I mentioned, this series and all the series we've done as part of the Consumer Rights Initiative is in part an effort to implement this guidebook, the Guidebook on Consumer and Economic Civil Legal Advocacy for Survivors, which is a comprehensive guide specific to specifically developed through a survivor-centered lens and tailored to survivors' needs and built upon all the richness of advocacy and attorneys across the country. So I want to highlight a few features that are in that guidebook, since that's really a supplement to you all today as you're thinking about credit, reporting and repair, housing barriers, and how they intersect with all of these other issues that you see here, and there are even more. And these are all issues that Claire and her students are going to touch on. So first, survivor stories. A really important question for us is always, how does this issue show up in the lives of survivors? And how does it show up differently based on survivors' intersecting identities? So the guidebook really offers case scenarios to help ground and immediately apply the content of each chapter. That really helps you kind of think through, what are the cases that I'm seeing? What are survivors bringing? How am I working through this? So again, we invite you to share right now your experiences, common struggles, unique or new or emerging needs that we can try to touch on today. Second, we really like to think deep and do some issue spotting. So connected to survivors' experiences, we really promote this idea of a full economic assessment and critical reflection about what we as advocates bring to the table, what survivors bring to the table as experts in their own lives and situations, and then how we can really work in partnership to address, in this case, housing, economic and consumer-related barriers to housing. We have a whole slew of other resources to help think about how to integrate economics more fully into everything from intake to fuller assessment, and I'll be sure to drop those into the chat. But we just invite you to think about that, and Claire and students will be thinking through some specific housing-related questions that can help guide our advocacy with survivors. Oops. And then finally, there's the important question of what can we actually do? The guidebook strives to offer strategies and legal remedies that are unique and must look different in order to meet survivors' unique safety needs. So we work to gather really practical tips from across the country, from advocates, from attorneys, from others doing this work. And so this guidebook really helps think through possible solutions, caveats, thinking about unintended consequences, and ways that you can really use to tailor to your own organization. So all of this is to say it's important that we hear from you about these needs so we can apply them to the training. And it looks like we've got folks kind of doing broader advocacy on the call who are specific housing advocates. We've got some program and executive directors. So thank you. That's really helpful to hear. And please keep bringing your perspective and what is helpful if you're thinking from like a program design level, from a community change level, and from individual, knowing the intricacies of individual advocacy. That will be really helpful. Okay, so now I just want to lay some of the landscape so we're all on the same page looking at what is it that survivors are experiencing as they navigate, access, and maintain housing. Oh, this is fast. So, spoiler alert. First, what we see here is both the large need and the large amount of work that's being done. This is data taken from Muskie, which is an entity that compiles and analyzes all the grant reporting of OVW-funded programs, and this is from their 2016 report to Congress. And what it essentially shows is that housing is a huge need and priority among survivors as well as among programs. We see that nearly 3 in 4 of all funded programs provide emergency shelter, and almost half also provide some sort of transitional housing program. And combined, OVW-funded programs shelter or house over 38,000 adults and children, which is amazing. And even with this effort, there is still large unmet need. 12,000 requests go unmet, and of those, 60% are housing related. So this will come as no surprise to you, although I'd love to hear any specifics about kind of what's the rub for those of you who are doing housing. What might be the most critical barrier? Is it housing stock? Is it cost? Is it something like credit or criminal record barriers? So we know that there's a need and that it's being prioritized in the work, and yet there are still gaps. So with this, and that we know survivors face prolonged housing instability, looking a little deeper at those experiences is next up. And I even hesitate to show this slide a little bit because it's so dated, but it does show some actually persistent needs that have not changed much, or maybe have changed but just look a little bit different. We really need updated research in the area, and I'd love to talk with any of you on the call to kind of hear more about what you're seeing. But to cover it briefly, this slide shares some findings from a study that was done in a Midwestern city with 141 women, looking specifically at differences between white and African American survivors in the shelter program. And this just shows some key findings. On the right, you'll see data that Black survivors compared to their white counterparts were coming with different experiences, which made them stay longer in shelter overall, or on average. They had less access to a car, while at the same time they were more likely to be the sole provider in their household and to be living in poverty. They also tended to report more severe abuse. And then on the left, we see their range of needs after leaving shelter. So they stayed in shelter for 10 or more weeks, and they're leaving with issues like health care, education, social support, and material goods. And this is all to say that the barriers to housing are inherent in here, as are how they interlock with other economic needs that survivors come with, and that one's experiences in shaping how those needs show up is really important. Does this resonate with folks? Are you seeing the same thing? Like I said, this is an old study, but I'd love to hear from you all. I hear from Eileen that previous evictions and having a damaged rental and housing history is a big barrier, and that's obviously not in this, and that is the focus of this webinar, so that's great. I'll move on, but if you guys have thoughts or reactions to this, please toss it in the chat. This slide, I won't spend much time here, but really underscores that survivors of color are more likely to be both dual arrested and generally overrepresented in the criminal justice system. And as I just mentioned from Eileen, what that produces unique and multiple barriers to housing, like the impact of having criminal record. And there are other unique barriers for those who are multiply marginalized by virtue of race, ethnicity, citizenship status, language, physical ability, mental health, gender identity, sexual orientation, and on and on. And in fact, the National Alliance for Safe Housing conducted a national needs assessment recently, and both credit and criminal records were among the top barriers to both accessing and sustaining housing. And this is across housing sectors, whether it's DV specific, homeless, and even the private housing sector. So this is all to say that our understanding of these full experiences, who is experiencing barriers and what kinds of barriers, is really helpful as we strategize possible solutions. And I'll end on this that really just tries to compile available research and categorize kind of where different barriers related to housing fall across the life course. We know that housing coupled with other economic needs required for safety are not one-off issues, as you all know, but rather they have an economic ripple effect across the life course. This zooms in on our broader ripple effect graphic, specifically through a housing lens to show how abuse is connected to things like shelter requirements and housing availability, which are connected to landlord abuse, and not being offered accommodation despite VAWA protections, to having chronic housing instability and even homelessness, compiling debts, and even lost opportunities that continue to entrench survivors in economic insecurity. So understanding this long view is really helpful in our day-to-day advocacy, and that it can help point to important levers of change that could really counter this ripple effect by looking at the long-term issues that we need to be attentive to. And just as a suggestion, we've actually done this as an activity with advocates in North Carolina and in other areas, and is a nice way to get specific and get a full sense of how is this issue showing up and how is it changing over time for your program, in your community, even in your state, to facilitate some strategic thinking. So for some of those folks in the room, if this is of interest, that would be great. Otherwise, this sort of is a nice way to compile some evidence that perhaps you can use in some of your advocacy and puts us on the same page in terms of what we're doing, what the need is, what survivors are experiencing as Claire and students dive in. So I'm going to hand it off and just want to uplift that folks are saying that credit and evictions are a huge barrier, the lack of affordable housing in general, the link to transportation Amanda is lifting up, absolutely, utility bills and collections, absolutely. So that's a great segue to Claire and students to kind of think about all of those issues and how they play into credit reporting and repair and other advocacy strategies. So again, thank you, Claire and all, for joining us, and I'll hand it off to you.
Well, thank you so much to CSAJ for that fantastic introduction and overview of the issues, and thank you all for joining us. It looks like we have over 50 people from all over the country, and so good morning and good afternoon to all of you. My name is Claire Johnson-Raba. I teach here in the Consumer Law Clinic at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. Before I joined UCI, I was a longtime legal aid attorney and a consumer rights advocate with a specific focus on the consumer rights of domestic violence survivors. I'm joined today by 3 students here at UCI. Kevin Gamara and Ronan Tang are second-year law students in the Consumer Law Clinic. And Sai Upadhyayula is a second-year law student at in the Domestic Violence Clinic. So we're going to go ahead and lead off here with Sai, talking a little bit about the domestic violence basics and how those intersect with economic issues and economic abuse. And then we'll move on to some of the specifics in a deep dive from the Consumer Law Clinic students.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sai Upadhyayula, and I'm an advanced clinic student in the Domestic Violence Clinic here at UC Irvine School of Law. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to jump back into an attendee poll. And thank you all for being such an active and engaged group. We'd like to revisit the Get to Know You. Our wonderful attendees represent, for the benefit of each other, the myriad ways in which you serve as advocates. So go ahead and remind us about your roles, whether you are a domestic violence attorney, or if you focus more on consumer rights, if you're a social worker, or if you're a community-based advocate, and then select E for any kind of different type. If more than one applies, choose the one that best describes your role, and if you select E, we'd love it if you share your advocacy in the group. And we can acknowledge you and keep your background in mind for the presentation.
Great. It looks like we have a little bit of everybody here. That's wonderful. We like to see a fair number of, a broad swath of advocates. It looks like a number of people are frontline advocates. And we have about half of you don't quite fit into any of these categories that we've set up. Oh gosh, it sounds like we may be having a problem with the audio. I'm hearing I see a couple of things in the public chat that people are having problems with the audio. We will try and project, and I hope that will solve it rather than it being a technical issue. Okay, well, it looks like from your comments in the chat that a number of people actually run domestic violence programs, and we also had some consumer advocates to help build credit among survivors. So that's excellent. We'll go ahead and wrap up this poll, and we'll ask the next poll.
Okay, so poll question number 2. Does your organization include questions about financial abuse during the screening or intake process? So let us know if you already do this important function, if no, you don't do this yet, or if sometimes and to a limited extent.
And feel free to chat any specifics or details or questions that you might have there, and I'll drop in some resources that might be helpful too.
And please do continue to give us updates if the audio is not working here from the UCI side. We are on a speakerphone here, but we can always pick up the handset and pass it around if it's not working for you guys to hear us. Okay, good. Glad to see the audio is okay.
Okay, great. Thank you for your responses. Looks like the majority of you already do include questions about financial abuse during the screening and intake process, but some of you don't. We want to certainly advocate for that. So thank you for getting started on question 3 as well. This is our last polling question for today. If yes, at what point does your organization screen for financial abuse? And that can be at intake, if financial concerns arise during the course of representation, or when the client returns to your organization after suffering some displacement as a result of financial abuse or another situation. And please qualify those other responses in the chat box. For those of you who don't yet screen for financial abuse, I do want to put a plug in for CSAJ materials, which can help you get started on this critical service. There are model screening tools available for implementation. We'll provide a link a little bit later on, and looks like there's one in the chat as well. So, great.
Great, so we can also revisit these responses once everyone's had a chance to respond, but it looks like the majority of folks are doing some screening, who are screening, are doing screening at intake or when issues arise during the representation. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move on to some of the basics on DV control with a focus on economic and financial abuse.
Great, thank you, Claire. Okay, so the basics of domestic violence control. The first thing I want to introduce you to is this idea of coercive control introduced by Evan Stark in a 2009 book called Coercive Control. And he describes it as a pattern of violent acts and a political framework, the pattern of social, institutional, and interpersonal controls that usurp a survivor's capacity to determine her destiny. So we talk about the theory of coercive control as illuminating, just as consumer advocacy does, how these issues and patterns are multifaceted, systemic, enduring, not only individual or episodic. Going a bit more into coercive control and how that relates to domestic violence. So coercive control exemplifies a power dynamic, an ongoing, oftentimes gendered, and personalized microregulation of everyday behaviors. So this trends through both social space as well as through time. And we see that there's control over an exploitation of an individual, the survivor's survival resources, and that can be things like their housing resources, their financial resources, and their personal, for example, economic benefits. Again, I want to reiterate that these effects are cumulative, and so ongoing rather than episodic, and cumulative rather than incident-specific. So if we break down these dynamics, subordination of will by the violation of physical integrity, that's what we call domestic violence. The deprivation of respect and autonomy can be categorized as intimidation. Deprivation of social connectedness is isolation, and appropriating or denying access to resources required for personhood and citizenship is control. So many of you may be familiar with what we call the power and control wheel that kind of describes in sort of an abuser-centric model violence beyond the physical and sexual that pervade a daily experience for survivors. So domestic violence is the exercise of this abusive behavior, again, in a systematic pattern of power and control, and perpetuated by one intimate partner against another. This can include myriad types of abuse and violence, not limited to physical violence, sexual violence, threats, and beyond that, for the modern age, digital abuse, technological abuse, abuse related to immigration status, using children in these kinds of control, usurping medical care and other resources. So just to emphasize that these behaviors can be contextualized in this way. And now turning a bit more towards economic abuse. So there is a statistic that the number one cause of homelessness for women and kids is domestic violence. And approximately half of domestic violence survivors who leave end up falling below the poverty level. So what we see is almost all survivors report experiencing some form of economic abuse, which can be defined as controlling a survivor's ability to acquire, use, and maintain these economic resources. This often manifests also in interference with access to education and employment, so long-term downstream effects on the survivor's opportunities and prospects. Now, economic abuse translates into the experience of financial abuse and subsequently financial despair. So financial abuse occurs when the batterer controls estate planning, access to financial resources, and tends to monopolize all financial decisions in that household. And victims are often forced to take part in unlawful financial transactions, getting them into more trouble, and again, perpetuating the systemic form of abuse. What this leads to is financial despair, this feeling of being unable to provide for oneself or one's family without the batterer's assistance, and that there is a notable insufficiency or inaccessibility of this emergency assistance. There's a study that in very small font is cited, a Texas study in which 85% of victims who were polled had fled between 5 and 7 times previously and cited financial despair as the number one reason for returning to the batterer. So again, we talk about contextualization and the systemic effects of abuse and control, and there is this economic ripple effect. So starting off during the relationship, we can summarize this effect as foregone personal advancement, so job loss, credit damage, theft, debt, missed work days, and then emanating outwards, leaving the relationship, you have the issue of uncertainty and instability in the form of relocation costs, job and housing instability, incurred debt from marriage, and healthcare costs or other kinds of medical debts. When moving to the short term, you have the issue of direct costs in the form of foregone wages, housing instability. You have the cost of children or the cost of independent living, legal fees. And finally, in the long term, you have these more insidious types of opportunity costs and a sense of vulnerability. So more consumer impacts, education and professional development impacts, mental health and quality of life effects, and just vulnerability to future abuse. So finally, we're going to talk a little bit about screening for financial abuse, and many of you said that you already do this. So we'd love to know in the chat what works well for you to assess survivors' broad economic needs when talking about housing. And of course, recall those CSAJ resources, screening tools, and I believe some webinars for issue spotting as well. So to go this very briefly, financial insecurity leads to increased vulnerability to violence. We talked about that in the previous slide. It's important to incorporate questions about credit, banking, and debt in these domestic violence intake interviews. We want to collect information about prior economic harms. We also want to ask about control over and knowledge about financial resources in the home. Again, whether those are monopolized by the batterer and what the survivor's knowledge is about those issues in order to secure future economic security. It's particularly important to highlight in divorces or permanent restraining orders, access to property to which the survivor is entitled, asking for vacate orders or rental payments in restraining or protective orders. And finally, the best source of information is the client's credit report. And again, we recommend consulting the resources available. The next slide is pretty much just a step-by-step reiteration of the previous information, so I'm not going to go through it again, but just for your reference. And I'm going to pass it back to Claire to talk about a survivor story.
All right. So I'm going to tell you a bit of a story of a client that I represented and worked with at Legal Aid before I came to the UCI Consumer Law Clinic. And one of the things this story represents is the way that different advocates can work together to provide holistic services and a good outcome for a survivor. So we had a client who came through the family law unit at the Legal Aid office that I worked with. And the family law attorneys, once she was stabilized and there was a protective order in place, referred her to the consumer advocates because she had been a victim of identity theft at the hands of the abuser.
We actually worked with a local nonprofit organization, an organization called SportPoint, which is run by the United Way, in order to provide assistance with that frontline piece of identity theft. So there are non-attorney advocates who can be impactful and very important in providing the initial assistance in resolving things like identity theft. The nonprofit organization sent a number of dispute letters, helped Miriam send a number of dispute letters, and went with her to the police station to help her get the police report. Police reports, as we'll discuss later, are a necessary piece of disputing identity theft under state and federal laws. Most of the fraudulent accounts were removed from the credit report, but there was one creditor that refused to delete despite our dispute letters, and so the client was unable to qualify for housing, so some project-based Section 8 that she otherwise would have been qualified for. So the Legal Aid consumer team helped write letters for her on behalf under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and we actually ended up filing a lawsuit against this creditor and the credit reporting agencies and got the information removed and actually got a settlement for the client. So all these advocates working together and working in collaboration with their specific areas of expertise, we got all this information that was fraudulently placed on her credit report removed, and we also placed freezes on her credit reports so additional harm could not be done. So this is an example of ways in which multiple community advocates can work together to provide a good outcome for a client and her children. We discussed previously ways in which access can be restricted to financial resources. And so survivors often come out of a relationship with what's called a thin credit file because they don't have many accounts that are opened in their name. So as Sai talked about, these are a number of the ways in which the abuse and control can happen and be demonstrated within the economic realm. As CSAJ mentioned in the introduction, the effects of economic and financial abuse are magnified among marginalized populations that are already subject to predatory lending practices or may not have fair and affordable credit products available in their neighborhoods. For example, when domestic violence survivors are located in neighborhoods where there are payday lenders, but there are not community credit unions that will offer them affordable credit products, credit cards, and things like that, they're subject to payday lenders and other sort of predatory short-term lending products. We know that a number of people with Section 8 vouchers may have those vouchers, but then they expire because they're unable to obtain housing. And that affects these marginalized populations that don't have as much access to market rate housing. Our immigrant survivors are also impacted because there are fewer credit products available for people with thin credit products or maybe an ITIN instead of a Social Security number. And then youth are impacted. Our young survivor clients, maybe those who've been in the foster youth system, things like that, again, have fewer resources available to them. And so when you look at economic and financial abuse that burdens people on top of lack of access to the credit market, we look at people who are burdened in double ways. And then we also have seniors who may be living on a fixed income and not have access to expanding their credit opportunities. So we want to take into account when we serve clients holistically those additional limitations when we're helping them to build their economic stability and their financial stability when we're helping them to obtain housing. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Kevin Gamara, who's going to do a little bit of a deep dive into consumer reports and their relationship to access to rental housing.
Thank you so much, Claire. Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Gamara. I'm a student here with the Consumer Law Clinic. And so we're going to discuss the role of consumer reports in access to rental housing. So first, starting off with what a consumer report is. It is a statement that has information about you or the survivor you're representing, their credit activity, and their current credit situation. And so the information that's contained in these consumer reports is personal information such as your name, current and former addresses, birth date, social security number, as well as their credit accounts, the credit limit associated with the account, the type of account it is, where it's a mortgage, installment, revolving, and then the account balance. And additionally, what you can find on these reports are public records. And so actually this is something I'm going to talk about in further detail later, but such public records that are included are liens, foreclosures, bankruptcies, and the particular area of interest that has changed are civil suits and judgments. And so just continuing on, you know your credit report is important, but the 3 nationwide consumer reporting agencies, namely Equifax, TransUnion, Experian, these are not the only companies that collect information on you and the survivors you're representing. Other companies collect information and prepare consumer reports about you. And then these reports are used to inform decisions about providing consumers with credit, or in this case, residential rental housing. And for example, you have the CoreLogic Safe Rent Score. It's a proprietary tenant screening system that predicts the likelihood of lease default using the applicant's credit history and rental application. And so, going into the next slide. So yes, now we're going to take a deeper dive into that public record information that I was referring to. So recently, the National Consumer Assistance Plan, NCAP, was passed, and it requires that reporting agencies report with a higher degree of accuracy. And so as a result, we've seen that all civil judgments and about half of the tax liens on consumer credit reports, they have been removed as a result. The reason being that with civil judgments, typically you will just have one court document and it will have a name on it, but multiple people can be associated with this one name. And so just to avoid any liability, we've seen that consumer reporting agencies have just stopped reporting civil judgments. However, we have seen that the number of bankruptcies being reported has essentially remained unchanged. That is because there are other points of access to verify this information, namely at the banks, for example, and thus reporting agencies feel comfortable reporting any bankruptcies that your survivor may have. And additionally, as previously mentioned in the chat, we see that eviction records are still being reported because they also have a higher degree of accuracy. And this is very important to make note of because landlords typically will not rent to potential tenants who have evictions. And additionally, while many people would know whether or not there would be an eviction on their record, it is important to keep note of when dealing with survivors because they may not know what's happened to their home once they've left to get away from the assailant. And so now talking about how to obtain these consumer reports, it's important to note that under the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act, FCRA, all consumer reporting companies are required to provide you with a copy of the information in your report if you request it, and you are entitled to a free credit report every 12 months. And so typically with the big 3, this is where you can access for free, and we have 3 methods in which you can do that via the phone, online at annualcreditreport.com, or by mail from their P.O. box. We do recommend at least making use of this free resources provided by the big 3. It is 100% verified, so please feel comfortable pulling from this resource. And then on the next slide, we actually have an example of a specialty consumer report that we were referring to earlier. This one is from CoreLogic. And actually, if you'll make note, one of the lines it requests is an address. And so going on to our next slide really quickly, this is a potential barrier to accessing consumer reports, especially for survivors who may be moving from address or not in their current address. And so a proposed solution would be to request a credit report by phone or using a P.O. box, having them set up one, or if you can check with your Secretary of State, for example in California, and I know Missouri as well, they do have safe-at-home addresses which are specifically created for survivors or for victims of domestic violence as a substitute mailing address to receive first class, certified, and registered mail. And now I'm going to pass it over to Ronan to take a deeper dive into identity.
Hello everyone, so my name is Ronan Tang. I'm here with the Consumer Law Clinic at UC Irvine School of Law. We're moving on to the topic of identity theft. Identity theft occurs when someone else steals your identifying information for their own financial advantage, and usually it is at your financial disadvantage. And for example, when someone files a tax return in your name and the IRS recognizes it and claims a refund for them, and then you submit your own tax return and the IRS rejects your request as a duplicate. Identity theft occurs a lot in the domestic relationship because usually abusers have full or complete access and control to the survivor's bank accounts, and they also have the legal privilege of being a legal spouse, and they can open a joint bank account with you. And any of their acts may negatively affect your credit reports and other records. So as such, we do have some safety planning for survivors. And for example, the banking strategy, you can choose to close the joint bank accounts with the abusers. You can secure your existing bank accounts by changing the personal information to your own information. And also you can choose to create your own bank accounts. The whole purpose of it is to separate your bank accounts from the abusers and also gain a complete control of your own bank accounts. And we also have some advocacy strategy here. You can choose to file a police report, file a complaint with FTC, and assert the rights under the FCRA and state statutes, which I will talk in more detail after that. And also, there are some safety concerns associated with safety planning. For the survivors who are not living with abusers anymore, it is very important to keep your personal information private, because sometimes you want to live in a private shelter with the location not publicly available. And some common methods is to change the passwords of all the accounts, change the phone numbers, and be careful about revealing your location on the social media. And make sure that sometimes you have to turn off the location data on your cell phone, because it is automatically sharing your location information.
We hear that the audio might be cutting out a bit, that Julia Pacheco-Figueroa has reported that the audio is cutting out a little bit. Let's see if we can get the phone just a little bit closer to Ronan so we can get her, her audio just through a little bit better.
Okay, just tell me if any of the audio is not working well, and we can try to work it out.
Okay. Okay, other people are reporting the audio might be okay. Okay.
Okay.
But we'll continue to try and speak up and keep the phone close to the person who's speaking.
So aside from the general safety planning, we also have, of course, some statutes that survivors can use to protect themselves. For example, the Identity Theft and Assumption Deterrence Act makes identity theft a federal crime. And most states have their own state statutes to make it a crime to misuse another person's identifying information, regardless of the relationship between the perpetrator and the victims. For example, in California, we have the Penal Code Section 530.5 and makes it a felony or a misdemeanor. And also the FCRA, Fair Credit Reporting Act, it regulates the financial institutes and creditors. They have a duty to prevent, to detect, and mitigate ID theft. And also, if someone reports with sufficient documents of an identity theft incident, they are required, the credit reporting agency are required to move the fraudulent account within 5 days. And in California, we also have this Investigative Consumer Reporting Agencies Act. And it regulates that consumers should be given a copy of their investigative reports if they require so. And most states have their own Consumer Rights Act, and just to make sure to check the statutes of our own state and make sure that it is not preempted by any federal statute. So moving on, it is an overview of the steps that DV survivors can use to report a fraudulent account incident to the credit reporting agency. The step one is to review the credit reports to identify any fraudulent accounts that is not opened by you. And also, you can file a complaint with FTC. With you can file it online, and we have the link provided here. And you can also do so by call the number that is provided here. And make sure that you save a copy of your own, because as soon as you submit online form, it is gone to the records of FTC, and it is not automatically saved as a copy for yourself. And step 3 is not mandatory, but it's highly recommended that you obtain a police report to document ID theft, because it will increase the likelihood that you can clear the fraudulent account. But as a caveat, because this step may alert the authorities of a crime that can bring potential charges, criminal charges. And if the DV survivors are still living with the abusers, we also want to warn them about the consequence of it, and it may irritate the abusers sometimes. And the last step is to remove or dispute the fraudulent account, and it will relieve of any debt liabilities and other negative credit reports.
And sorry to interrupt, but just to chime in, it would be great to hear from folks how their dealing with some of that identity theft issue. We just held a peer exchange call actually on coerced debt and identity theft, and I know not only for the implications if a survivor is living with an abusive partner, but engaging with law enforcement and criminal justice, as we talked about at the beginning, might not be an option or a need for some survivors. So for those of you, and I know there are some experts on the call based on what you've kind of shared with us so far, would love to hear how you're strategizing around that identity theft process, maybe what has worked or what would be helpful as you go forward, or if you have any further insights. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So we'd like to hear your feedback on this issue, and here in the slide we're providing a very brief checklist of the thing that you have to do to file a police report. And we also provide a link to the FTC's memo that you can use as your own reference. FTC also has other special forms of ID theft that you can use. For example, the tax identity theft, child identity theft, and also medical identity theft. And with all the information are provided in the link at the bottom of the page. Now we're hand it back to Kevin to talk about the Fair Credit Reporting Law.
Hello again, everyone. And so now we're just going to talk about some of the laws under the Federal Credit Reporting Act that actually protect consumers. And so the first one is the right to an accurate report of information. So consumer reporting agencies must correct and delete inaccurate, incomplete, or unverifiable information, usually within 30 days. So when they do their investigation, if they verify the information is accurate, then they will continue to report it. In cases of fraud and inaccuracy, it's helpful to send a dispute letter to the creditor as well as the consumer reporting agency. An important note for all of you advocates that the dispute must come directly from the consumer and not from the advocate or attorney. And so please, just assist the survivor when they draft a letter, and this will actually be huge help for any consumer attorney down the line. And then another protection under the FCRA is that you have the right to dispute. Consumers have the right to dispute incomplete or inaccurate information, and if you identify and report incomplete and or inaccurate information to the consumer reporting agency, the agency must investigate unless your dispute is frivolous. And so we see this question here, but we'll address it in just a short second. I wanted to first show you a template provided actually from the Consumer Financial Board. In this, you can see how to properly dispute it, just fill in the proper information. And again, advocates would recommend that you sit down with your survivor and just go through the necessary information with them. And so now we'd actually love to hear from you guys in the chat. But I was just wondering, why not call up the creditor that is misreporting? Why do you think it is better to go through the credit reporting agency first?
While folks are responding and thinking about that, I just wanted to lift up what some folks have said about the screening process. Both Melina and Amanda kind of talked about issues with screening and assessment being one of timing, making it trauma-informed, and connecting it to the needs. So Melina said that a lot of difficulties is remembering information. I hear that, and we know that's often a thing with survivors, in addition to not having access to important financial information. And then Amanda mentioned that it's helpful to do sometimes a deeper dive and pull credit reports, for example, when you're starting the search for housing, or when you're working on, some folks do it in family law cases to prep for different things to make sure that you understand their full credit history. And so I think that those strategies are really helpful.
Definitely. And then just referring back to the question, actually, thank you, Elizabeth. You are 100% correct. So the reason why we'd want to go through the Consumer Reporting Agency first is because it is the reporting agency's investigation with the creditor that creates the right to sue under the FCRA if their investigation is insufficient. And so really, for your survivor, if there is really an issue on their credit report, is we highly recommend following the proper channels of reporting and disputing these inaccuracies, just so that should this investigation prove to be unfruitful, they would still retain that right to sue and hopefully retain some form of relief that way. And then lastly, another protection under the FCRA is the 7-year limitation on negative information. And so consumer reporting agencies are not allowed to report outdated negative information. And so in most cases, a consumer reporting agency will not report negative information that is more than 7 years old or bankruptcies that are more than 10 years old. And so just as a last recommendation to you advocates, when dealing with these survivors, if you see that this 7-year limitation is close to running up, maybe then just recommending to your survivor to just hold off and just wait till this negative information expires and will then just automatically be removed from their consumer reports.
So we're going to pause for a moment and answer any questions. Yvette and Sarah, have you seen any questions in the chat we'd like to address about credit reports and ID theft at this point? I think Elizabeth raises an important issue, that there are bad actors out there, credit repair organizations that promise to fix people's credit for a fee, and that those are not legitimate organizations. And to distinguish our clients' disputes from those frivolous disputes, it's necessary to put as much supporting information as possible in the disputes. So writing a letter with specific information about the incidents of fraud, as much as the survivor might know, helps to pass that threshold of not being a frivolous dispute, and heightens the burden on the consumer reporting agency and then that creditor to actually do a better investigation. So the creditors seem to sell off bad debt and it gets put back on the credit report. We do have a few slides later on about debt collection, and it does, so there is no re-aging of bad debt. So that means that 7-year rule is an absolute rule from the time the debt goes bad. So from the time she stops paying it, it should drop off the credit report regardless of which creditor owns it after 7 years. It's true that if it is sold to a new debt buyer, that new debt buyer also gets to report a new trade line. So say you have a debt to Wells Fargo and it gets bought by Portfolio Recovery Acceptance. That means both Wells Fargo and Portfolio Recovery Acceptance will both have information reported on the credit report. However, both Portfolio and Wells Fargo must delete their trade line 7 years after the consumer stopped paying the bills to Wells Fargo. That's a good question, Erica. That's actually a bit of a calculation. So if you look at most of the big 3 consumer reports, the TransUnion, Experian, and Equifax, they will have information that says this debt will be removed from your credit report on XYZ date. And so that way you can calculate back at that date, or month and year usually. And so you know that the debt went delinquent 7 years prior to that month and year. This is one reason that it's necessary to pull your credit reports from the original source using annual credit report from TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian. A number of for-profit, advertising-driven websites and things that are out there that offer people consumer reports, they offer reprints or merged reports, and they might not have that information about when a debt will plan to be dropped off a credit report, but TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian will have that information.
And one of the advocates that we worked with as a strategy suggested that when you're first doing this, because you have access to free reports, to try to pull from all 3 of those big 3, and then over the time as you're just kind of managing this and keeping an eye on it, then and because there are other free options, you can kind of use those resources to check quarterly, or if you kind of have an action plan with survivors. So that's one tip that we've heard elsewhere too.
Right, I would second that. And Yvette, in response to the question about survivors who are hesitant to go to the police. I mean, it's always a question whether or not to go to the police, but one thing that's one way in which the broader support community may be helpful. So a non-attorney advocate, a caseworker, or a social worker might be available as a support person for a trip to the police station. In addition, many jurisdictions take online police reports, and so it's helpful to check in your jurisdiction to see if a trip to the police station is even necessary. And one thing to consider, while a police report is technically a criminal investigation, many jurisdictions don't have the resources to investigate individual cases of identity theft. And again, the FTC affidavit of identity theft is also a statement under penalty of perjury, and that does not require involvement with the police, and the FTC does not investigate individual reports of identity theft. So if the police department if interactions with the police department creates a barrier to reporting, the FTC affidavit of identity theft can provide sufficient information under penalty of perjury to support a dispute based on identity theft. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move on. We're going to hand off to Cy to talk about credit scores, because it's not just getting the credit report that is that important. The credit score, as Kevin talked previously about housing providers like CoreLogic SafeRent, they may only look at a credit score and they might not look comprehensively at the credit report. So let's go ahead and talk about what goes into the credit score, and then I'll talk a little bit about debt, and we will talk about ways to improve credit scores.
Okay, so very briefly, I'm going to give you a quick overview of credit scores, and then we'll give you a chance to ask questions about both credit scores and the following section on debt collection and the life cycle of defaulted debt after Claire returns. So first thing is I'm going to introduce you to another term, coerced debt. And so as we know, discussed previously, abusers will use and abuse credit as a means of control with potentially devastating emanating effects on a survivor's economic prospects. So coerced debt is all non-consensual credit-related transactions that occur in this type of violent relationship. Now, this can be opening accounts without the partner's knowledge or consent, running up extremely high balances and refusal to pay those balances, forcing survivors to obtain loans or other kinds of financial instruments against their interests, and lying about paying the bills on time or at all, leaving them stuck with those ramifications. The credit history does impact myriad sectors, so think housing, employment, car and home insurance, utilities, banking, etc. So this is really just a slide differentiating terms for your reference. It can be used as a primer when talking to your survivors. We're going to focus on credit scores today. And credit scores are the numbers determined by a statistical algorithm given to an individual based on the information on their credit report. And this is, for example, a FICO score. So this is used by lenders or landlords as a quick way to assess how likely it is that a person will repay their debts. And as a result, the credit score is something that sticks out to a lot of people, and it's worth knowing what goes into generating that score. So on the next slide, have a little graphic just kind of breaking down the factors that determine credit scores. And we see here that the largest portion is devoted to payment history. So did the survivor participate in paying bills? And is their payment history harmed by coerced debt, as described previously, or other kinds of financial abuse? Are there accounts that are recognized by the survivor? If it was medical debt, for example, when was it recorded? If the survivor is included on marital accounts, if married, then especially credit card accounts, that's important to note. And are they maxing out their card if they're using their card and they're paying all those bills on time? Length of accounts. So companies certainly prefer longer held accounts and payment histories. So was the survivor allowed to have their credit card or included in those accounts again? Were they an authorized user on any cards? It should be reported on their credit history. And how old is the survivor? Mix of credit, so what different types of credit does survivor have? Were they allowed on the mortgage or other kind of installment credits? Does the survivor have revolving credit cards in their name? Also things that are important to note that factor into determining the credit score. And finally, the impact of collection accounts, which have significantly negative effects on credit scores that can damage survivors' long-term economic plans. So important to ascertain that information. Do survivors have any accounts that are going into collections soon? And finally, kind of a quick list on how to improve credit scores. So as we kind of talked about previously, the consumer's best friend is time. You might want to wait out the 7 years so those negative entries drop off, and then try not to incur additional negative entries in that time. You can build credit with secured credit cards, and these are instruments for individuals with a particularly thin credit file, or use asset building techniques like peer lending circles, which are run by nonprofit organizations, and they are no interest free ways to build credit. And finally, using those credit cards carefully, paying down the balance, and keeping it less than 50% in terms of a debit to credit ratio on each card so that it doesn't negatively impact the credit score. I'm going to pass it back to Claire now.
So we're going to talk just a little bit now about debt collection and the life cycle of defaulted debt. Folks who are frontline advocates for survivors may see debt at different points. So I think we'd like to talk about the chronological steps that happen when a consumer stops paying on her credit card bills or various other debt. So the three main types of consumer debt that we generally are talking about are secured debt, and that's like your car loan or your home loan. And when you stop paying on your car loan or your home loan, the creditor is allowed to take back that property, and that's called a foreclosure or a repossession. A lot of the debt that will follow consumers around for a significant period of time while they're trying to obtain economic stability or look for housing is unsecured debt. That may be medical bills, credit card bills, and the debt collection of unsecured debt can take a mental health toll on survivors in the form of anxiety from telephone calls, letters, or even facing a debt collection lawsuit. The third kind of debt that consumers have to face is government debt. That would be court debt, maybe traffic or parking citations. In many states, that may result in the suspension of a driver's license, which creates an avalanche of additional problems, inability to get to work or school or get children to medical appointments. Federal student loans are also a burden for many survivors, especially if they're unaware of income-based repayment programs that are available through the federal government while they're trying to get their feet back on the ground. And unpaid taxes that may follow a survivor around, especially as a consequence of taxes that she may not be liable for, and there may be relief available through the IRS under innocent spouse or equitable spouse relief. The problem with not facing or not dealing with government debt is that government debt may result in the loss of important resources, such as garnishment of wages or the offset of a federal or state tax refund, including the loss of an earned income tax credit that a survivor may be relying on to cover expenses. So it's important to keep an eye on all these kinds of debt when we talk about doing an intake. Not all of these things will show up on a credit report. And so it's important to do a comprehensive intake that asks questions about other things and maybe pulls an IRS tax transcript to see if there is any abuse in the tax filing during a time when a survivor might be jointly liable for taxes filed by the abuser. So we don't want our clients to ignore debt collection issues. If a client is sued on a debt collection summons and complaint, we want our clients to respond to that. Your local self-help center at the courthouse may be available to help file an answer. There are also self-help resources available online. Make sure that if you're an attorney and you're helping your client but you're not familiar with this area of law, that you take a look and familiarize yourself briefly with your local rules in your jurisdiction and in your state. The debt collection process in each state is always a little bit different, and so I can't give you the step-by-step responses for how to respond to a debt collection lawsuit that are for California and assume that they're going to apply in what state your client may get sued in. For government debt collection, we want to make sure that your client is aware of any available ability to pay evaluations. While government debt is different from your defaulted credit card bills and that they can collect directly without a lawsuit, there are often and almost always options for people who are in a position where they can't afford to pay. So whether that is a call to your local state tax agency or a call to the IRS to let that agency know that your client is unable to pay, or it's enrollment in income-driven payment plans for federal student loans, or it's walking into court on a traffic or court debt and asserting an inability to pay, the government agencies should be receptive or have a program for folks who are unable to pay. So one thing to consider when we're talking about these defaulted unsecured debts for creditors, such as a credit card company, a medical debt, maybe private student loans, we're talking about a promise that a client made to pay under a contract and then stopped making payments. The debt collectors trying to collect on those defaulted contracts have a certain number of years to file a civil action to collect on those debts. So it's important to check your state statute of limitations, whether you're an attorney or an advocate in another type. It's a good idea to get an idea, to know what the statute of limitations, which is the limit, the deadline to file a lawsuit for a breach of contract. So in California, it's 4 years. In other states, it may be longer. I'm not sure. It's shorter. It's 3 years in a couple of states out on the East Coast. For the most part, it's 3-4 years or longer. It's important to remember that unlike the 7-year limit on the credit reports, because that 7 years is just 7 years and it always will be 7 years, and no matter who owns the debt, the 4-year statute of limitations in California, or whatever it is in your state, may be reset if a consumer makes small payments. So you can counsel your client, their survivor client, not to make small payments on an old debt, because that will reset that clock and give the creditor that many, in California 4 more years, or in your state 6 or 10 or however many more years, to sue your client on that debt. If your client is working with you to resolve old debt by settlement, it's better to save up that money and make a lump sum payment. But I will reiterate what Kevin said, especially, and what Sai said about improving credit scores. It is often better to let an old debt time out, especially if it's close to being time barred. If a debt is over your statute of limitations, there's generally very little reason or very little benefit to offering a settlement on that debt, because that debt can no longer be collected in court. So this requires a little bit of research into your state laws, maybe a little bit of a Google search to see what breach of written contract then the limitation is in your state. But we can point back to the question that somebody asked earlier about how do you know when that 7 years is up? Well, once you've calculated that 7-year date from your TransUnion, Equifax, or Experian credit report, then you can also do the math and count forward to see when the right to sue expires. So once you have that date for when that debt went bad, you can add 4, 5, 6 years, whatever your statute of limitations is on it, and know when that right to sue expires. And that can provide a survivor or any consumer client with a fair amount of peace of mind to know that the time has passed and that they can no longer be sued on that debt.
And I'll just, chime in for a practical resource there. In the Guidebook chapter on credit reporting and repair, there are some charts that have some of the basic time frames that debts stay on. So it would be really simple to take that and turn it into a chart that tracks the debt, the time frame, and then the statute of limitations, and just copy that. And that'd be a good thing that if you're an advocate or a program to take to as a partnership building tool to take to an attorney or a consumer law clinic at a legal aid or what have you to kind of talk through and get some help on how to build out those tools that you can use as you're doing some of those credit planning, some of that credit planning with survivors.
So, and I'm going to jump in and answer Loretta's question here real quick. You know, medical debt actually does not impact the credit score any longer in the same way that when the civil judgments were taken off the big three credit reports. There was a revision in the FICO score around 2017, not long after what happened with the civil judgments, and FICO scores are no longer counting medical debt. Now, if someone's still looking at a credit report, they'll see the lines of medical debt on there, but it is not calculated into the credit score. We will provide some information and some guidance shortly where Ronan will talk about ways to help tell the story of why bad credit looks the way it does and ways that we can help advocate for our clients or they can advocate for themselves in order to remediate some bad credit lines that are things like medical debt that were unavoidable. So sometimes, due to living in crisis or due to just being poor or not knowing how to address things through the court systems, survivors will have old judgments on their records. This may also occur if it was a joint debt and maybe the other side was served and the creditor was unable to find the survivor because she was living in shelter or was not living at the last known address that the creditor had. So sometimes if a debt was reduced to judgment, which means the creditor got a court order saying that she has to pay it, within a certain period of time, your state laws will allow for a set-aside or basically undoing that judgment. So that's something to check with your local legal aid office and your consumer rights advocates to see if they're doing any work on reversing default judgments that have been recently entered. The amount of time to undo a default judgment differs from state to state, but your local consumer advocates, just like those who do housing or eviction work, know how to undo a default judgment on an eviction. Your local consumer rights advocates may be able to assist with setting aside a default judgment, or your court self-help center may very well have a packet that will allow you to do a pro se, a self-represented motion to set aside default judgment. And that's helpful with both an eviction judgment or a court judgment for collection of a defaulted debt. The other couple of ways that debts end up getting paid off are through the paycheck, right? If that's a wage garnishment, or a bank levy, that's money taken out of the bank account, and obviously those are not the preferable ways, or a consumer can call up and enter into a negotiated payment plan. There are creditors who will take like $50 a month in a payment plan to avoid garnishment or levy, and again, we don't recommend that kind of payment plan unless there's a court judgment. Finally, bankruptcy will discharge unsecured debts. And in my work as a legal aid attorney, I certainly filed a number of bankruptcies for domestic violence survivors. Bankruptcy is a fresh start, and your local bankruptcy court may have a pro bono program that represents people with need who are low income, and domestic violence survivors may receive priority for pro bono attorneys through your local bankruptcy court's pro bono program. And then finally, if your client was married to the abuser, you could seek reimbursement for community debts in the family law court, and that assumes the abuser has a source of income. So let's pause for a minute. Maybe we have some questions here about credit scores and debt collection. It's a broad category. We've got a response from Loretta. And CSAJ has a wonderful resource on bankruptcy. And information on student loans and bankruptcy even, it looks like. Okay. Okay, so we'll go ahead.
I haven't seen anything else come in either.
Okay, great. So we'll go ahead and move. Well, I think we've been doing a good job answering the questions as they've been coming in. A great interface. I love the public chat and how real time it is. This is wonderful. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Ronan, who's going to talk. This is actually a great lead from what Sarah's just mentioned. The resource that Sarah has just put up, the the resources for helping explaining things to survivors and advocating with landlords and other entities. Ronan's going to talk a little bit about that, and also working with local credit unions and other second chance opportunities and asset building partners in our community.
Thanks, Claire. So aside from the regular ways that we have already discussed to repair the credit scores and other things, there's also ways to think out of the box, and there are also second chance opportunities that the people can use to restore their credit reports. So here we offer a brief introduction to the second chance banking products. The goal here is to get people back on track to banking at a traditional financial institution, even if you have a very bad credit or inactive banking history. So the negative records here can remain 7 years unless you successfully dispute it. And the second chance banking products are available in many banks across the nation and also in Western Union. We have a very brief list of the banks that have offered this kind of services, such as the BBVA and other banks. And we also have other resources here. Just to be aware that second chance banking products may come with upgrading systems or more restrictions, such as restrictions on check writing. And some services come with the fees that maybe like a monthly fee. But we also want people to look out for scams, because there are a lot of information online about second chance banking products, and we do not recommend people just use the information and find wherever they found online. We recommend people to go physically to the bank and obtain the information from the bank personnel, just to avoid scams. And moving on to the advocacy with landlords for a second chance. So as we discussed before, the negative eviction records or credit scores can remain for 7 years unless you dispute it. And we offer a solution here is to advocate, to talk with your landlord and offer a letter to the landlord that talk about the things that happened. And the ways you can do it is to obtain the letter from a social worker, from a shelter, or from attorney or other advocate here. And if it is an ID theft, file a dispute with the FTC or with the tenant screening company with proof of other residence. And we also have additional resources here, such as the VAVA 2013 and House Rights Domestic Violence Survivors, a state and local law compendium with the link provided here is also a resource. And also, such as in California, some states have their own statute. In California, it prevents landlords from evicting domestic violence survivors based on the domestic violence incident. And also, advocates provide letters of recommendation and support to help people to restore their credit scores and other negative records. Consumer advocates always focus on the survivor-centered advocacy, and they also help survivors to protect their right to privacy. Sometimes when survivors don't want to share their stories, such as they don't want to file a police report, there are always ways to go around that tool, and also they can still restore whatever they want to restore. Such as the second chance banking products, they often do not require survivors to share their personal stories, and they can also use some program completion certificates as a support for the incident.
So, and I'll just add here that this is partnering with our asset building colleagues in the nonprofit world is a wonderful way to provide additional indicia of economic stability for survivors who are no longer in crisis, who are out of the, who are no longer living in the home, and who are no longer in the situation that was causing the economic crisis. So if people go through second chance banking products, many credit unions or banks require a credit counseling class and ongoing classes. And so those classes will provide completion certificates and other things that indicate that the survivor is working actively on creating good credit and creating economic stability, and those are usually often requirements of getting a bank account. And so those things can indicate to a landlord that while a survivor went through a period of crisis previously, she's taking proactive steps to provide financial stability, and that she's working with community partners or nonprofit credit counselors in order to work on her credit. I know that nonprofit credit counselors have provided letters of advocacy and recommendation for my clients in the past, that I think have been beneficial in the housing context. So one of the final things, we would be negligent as consumer rights advocates if we didn't talk to you a little bit about looking out for scams. We always want to warn our clients in general for looking out for scams. If you Google things like credit repair on the internet, you're going to get all sorts of very scary, predatory credit repair organizations. When consumers are facing foreclosure, or if they've been sued on a debt collection lawsuit, or if they have a tax lien placed on their home, those things are public records. And so your client may get inundated by direct mail scams offering to save their house from foreclosure for a fee, offering to fix their credit for a fee, offering to deal with their tax lien for no money down or for a small monthly payment, right? Anything that sounds too good to be true probably is too good to be true. There is no such thing as a shortcut to credit repair. As one of our colleagues here on the public chat mentioned previously, credit repair organizations have a business model of sending a number of frivolous disputes, and they usually create more problems than they solve. Debt settlement companies, similarly, debt settlement companies advertise that for a monthly fee and for an automatic withdrawal from a bank account, that they'll be able to solve a consumer's credit problems and settle their debt for pennies on the dollar. Those are unreasonable promises that they're unable to keep, and debt settlement companies often charge high fees. And the consumer can still get sued. So debt settlement companies also promise a lot more than they can deliver. They overcharge, and they don't actually result in the resolution of consumer debt. Finally, student loan rescue scams. Anybody that calls you up on the phone or advertises on the internet or the bus stop or the radio that they can solve someone's student loan problems for a fee is a scam. There are free ways to deal with federal student loans. But those, you should look at studentaid.ed.gov, and those are free resources from the government that help people with consolidation and getting on income-based repayments. There are a number of nonprofit organizations that help with student loans as well, but no one should charge any money for any help with student loans. Finally, keep an eye out for housing listing scammers, the websites that list housing availability. You never want your client to wire money or send money in advance in order to hold an apartment. Often people will place fraudulent ads in order to scam people who are desperate for affordable housing out of the money that they've saved up for a down payment for a home. So we're going to move on to the last set of questions. We're almost here at about the end of our time. So we can go ahead and see, Yvette and Sarah, do we have some questions based on the stuff we've just covered?
There was a little bit of back and forth that seemed to be addressed in the chat, but someone asked about Lexington law as a dispute resource, and there's some hesitation about that.
Lexington Law is a credit repair organization, so one of the ways in which credit repair organizations and debt settlement companies pretend to not be credit repair organizations or debt settlement companies is that they rent a letterhead or they claim to be affiliated with a law firm. Lexington Law is, my clients have had terrible experiences with them. I've sent a number of dispute letters to get my clients' money back from Lexington Law. I personally would not consider that to be a legitimate organization. I would consider that to be a credit repair organization, and there really is no such thing as a credit repair organization that works. Again, that's a great idea, Elizabeth. We can look up people who report to. Good question, Sarah. So Elizabeth, we can look up on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's website and things like that to see if other people have reported about companies that are not on the level and that are not legitimate. So Credit Karma, Sarah, falls into a different category. Credit Karma is a for-profit company that provides information from credit reports that are available for free. And so if you think about it, a for-profit company that provides a product for free has a business model that's getting money from somewhere. And so Credit Karma's business model is advertising driven. And Credit Karma's business model is not transparent about the ads that they show, which means that if you're a person with good credit scores and you go on Credit Karma, they may show you, products that are prime products, but like good offers of credit cards. But for our clients with bad credit, Credit Karma tends to show predatory advertisements, and so I don't recommend using Credit Karma because it drives people toward things like debt settlement companies and credit repair organizations that I don't consider to be legitimate businesses, and that those ads are invisible frequently to advocates or other people who might use that. Again, in general, if anything's free, you want to be concerned about whether or not they're scraping your client's data and reusing it for another purpose. And at least in the context of Credit Karma, even though they say they don't resell the data they gather, they certainly are providing algorithmically your client's information and credit score information to their advertisers. So again, one of the reasons, and Credit Karma also doesn't provide, they're a tri-merge report, right? They provide a conglomeration of information. It's generally much better to go directly through annualcreditreport.com for the big three rather than go through something like Credit Karma, which is a for-profit business model that is repackaging information that's out there for free.
Just to follow up on that, Claire, we've some advocates we've talked with, this goes back to an earlier point that was made to rely on the free credit from the big three companies initially, but because it's free, that if an advocate is sitting there with a survivor, maybe Credit Karma can be useful to review a credit report in ongoing advocacy, and that way, since you're there, you can kind of explain how it might target particular ads and talk about the risks there. So we've heard that from advocates, that it's helpful because it's free to the advocate and the survivor, but it might be a longer-term advocacy strategy. I don't know what you think about that, Claire, because we obviously run up against kind of those costs to our programs and costs to survivors.
Right. I think within context, I think, everything is an individual evaluation, and so if sufficient context is provided, but I'm concerned about providing something that is visible as an app to the consumer on her phone that then she thinks it may be endorsed by an advocate, whether that's their DV attorney or their DV advocate or the consumer rights attorney. And so it concerns me because of the interrelationship between the advertising partners and Credit Karma, that the advertising may outweigh any benefit that may be available from it being like free an app.
That makes sense.
I do know that credit card companies, I believe Discover Bank will provide a credit score for free even if you don't have a Discover credit card. So there are some credit card companies that will provide a free credit score even if you don't have a credit card through that company.
Great.
But again, that's another for-profit business, right? But
sure.
But it's not
and so
necessarily
part of it is also as advocates is sort of asking those questions and meeting survivors where they are, and that it goes back to earlier conversation that some attendees were talking about in terms of how they talk about these and what tools they use and how it's integrated into advocacy, because it really is an ongoing process, and talking through trade-offs in all of these things, and thinking through what will work and strategizing with survivors. So that context point that you bring up, Claire, seems really integral to that long-term process.
We're just about at time here, and I know that there are additional slides that CSAJ has here that provide you with additional resources. CSAJ is an absolute leader in this field, and with information collected and model resources for things like dispute letters and how to work with landlords. However, if you have specific questions about consumer law, specifically as it relates to your survivor clients, feel free to send me an email. My email address is right here. I'm happy to answer questions. If you come up with something in practice and you want to just run it by me, I'm happy to respond to questions by email beyond the end of the webinar.
Well, thank you so much. This was a really great walk through credit, debt, and how it links to access to housing and all of that. Some things that I'll note and really highlight, I know I was sort of littering the chat with different resources throughout as Claire and all the students were talking. We'll make sure to send those and follow up to you all. You'll receive emails directly from us that have the recording, the PowerPoint, and all of these materials. I would also note that related to some of these second chance options, a lot of this to me brought up really exciting partnership ideas, and we actually had a webinar last week with the National Alliance for Safe Housing and a bunch of different innovative models, DV programs partnering with housing authorities partnering with other housing entities. We know of some flexible funding models that are out there. So we'll package all of this and share it with you, because to me that seems like a next question that I have. How can we take all of this, partner with attorneys that could help us figure out some of the legal questions, think about the different housing entities and how to create access right now while we're addressing credit and thinking longer term with survivors. So we'll put all of that together and make sure to share it with you so you really have a fuller compendium and story that you can draw from as you think about all of your work. And we don't have to go through all of these, all to say that we have a bunch of resources that help frame and might be helpful research and story and other things related to economic security for survivors, including the guidebook. I referenced a whole bunch of chapters. This topic really brings up how things like student loans and bankruptcy and predatory lending and all of these issues really interlock. And that is the purpose of the guidebook and really this webinar and all other webinars that we've held throughout the last couple of years, so that you can think about how do I think about these things and help survivors address these complex and intersecting issues that come up, and where do I need partners, and how can we elevate some of these issues that may be more systemic. So that is all I have. I know that you just shared another great resource. Do you have final comments or questions as we leave?
I don't. Just that was great, and thanks to our presenters and also everybody in the chat for participating so much.
Thank you all so much.